On my wedding day, my mother-in-law secretly switched my $3,000 designer gown with a $20 thrift store dress while I was getting my hair done. But when she stood up during the reception to humiliate me in front of 200 guests, I pulled out an eviction notice for the house she thought belonged to her son, the house that I actually owned. What happened next changed everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Natasha Reeves had always believed that love could conquer anything. At 28, she was a successful real estate attorney in the charming coastal town of Millbrook Harbor, Maine, where Victorian houses lined cobblestone streets and the smell of salt air mixed with fresh pine. She'd worked her way through law school on scholarships and waitressing tips, graduating summa cum laude before landing a position at the most prestigious firm in town. Her life was carefully built, deliberately constructed like the legal briefs she crafted. She owned a beautiful 1890s Queen Anne Victorian on Elm Street, a house she'd bought with her own money, renovated with her own vision, and cherished as the symbol of everything she'd accomplished. The wraparound porch overlooked the harbor, and on clear mornings, she could see the lighthouse that had guided ships safely home for over a century. Natasha had purchased the house 2 years earlier, at 26, after winning a particularly challenging case involving waterfront property rights. The previous owners, an elderly couple named the Hendersons, had been forced to sell due to financial difficulties. Natasha had paid cash, every dollar she'd saved since starting her career. The deed was in her own name alone, a fact that filled her with quiet pride every time she turned the key in the front door. She'd met Ryan Caldwell at a charity auction for the local animal shelter. He was everything she thought she wanted, charming, outgoing, and seemingly supportive of her career. Ryan worked as a regional sales manager for a medical equipment company, traveling frequently but always making time for romantic gestures when he returned. He brought her flowers, planned surprise dinners, and seemed genuinely impressed by her professional accomplishments. What Natasha hadn't anticipated was Dolores Caldwell. Ryan's mother was a force of nature in the worst possible way. At 58, Dolores had never worked outside the home, having married Ryan's father straight out of high school. When he'd passed away 5 years earlier, she'd moved from their family home in Portland to a rental property in Millbrook Harbor, Maine, to be closer to her baby boy. She had opinions about everything and shared them whether asked or not. From their first meeting, Dolores made it clear that she didn't think Natasha was good enough for her son. Ryan needs someone who will prioritize family, she'd said during that initial dinner, her pale blue eyes scanning Natasha's business attire with obvious disapproval. This all career nonsense is fine for now, but a woman's real job is supporting her husband. Natasha had bitten her tongue, telling herself that love meant accepting Ryan's family along with him. She'd grown up with a single mother who'd worked 2 jobs to support them, and the idea of a traditional family structure, even a complicated one, held a certain appeal. The criticism had started small. Comments about Natasha's expensive tastes when she bought organic groceries, suggestions that she was too focused on money when she discussed her cases over dinner, passive-aggressive remarks about how some women prioritized careers over what really mattered. But it was the comments about the house that stung the most. Of course, once you two are married, you'll probably want to sell this place, Dolores had said during one visit, running her finger along the custom millwork Natasha had spent months selecting. It's much too big for a young couple just starting out. You could use the money for something more practical. When Natasha explained that she loved the house and had no intention of selling, Dolores' smile had turned icy. Well, I suppose Ryan will have to see you reason eventually. Men know about these things. The engagement had been a whirlwind. Ryan proposed on the beach behind the house at sunset, with the lighthouse beams sweeping across the water. Natasha said yes because she loved him, because she wanted to believe that her mother's behavior was just pre-wedding nerves, and because she thought marriage might finally earn her Dolores' respect. Planning the wedding had been a minefield. Dolores inserted herself into every decision, from the flowers to, "The roses are so common, dear," To the venue, the Harbor Club is rather pretentious, don't you think? To the guest list, do we really need all these work colleagues of yours? Each battle left Natasha more drained, but Ryan consistently took his mother's side. She just wants to help, he'd say whenever Natasha tried to discuss her frustration. Wedding planning is stressful for everyone. Try to be understanding.
The dress had been Natasha's one victory. She'd fallen in love with the stunning Vera Wang gown at an upscale bridal salon in Boston, ivory silk with intricate beadwork and a cathedral train that made her feel like royalty. At $3,000, it was an extravagance, but it was her wedding dress, and she'd earned the right to splurge on something that made her feel beautiful. Dolores had accompanied her to the final fitting, making snide comments about the price and questioning whether such an elaborate gown was appropriate for a simple harbor town wedding. But the dress was perfect, and for the first time in months, Natasha felt like she was making a decision based on what she wanted, rather than what would keep the peace. 3 days before the wedding, Dolores had volunteered to pick up the dress from the salon, claiming she wanted to help with last-minute errands. Natasha, overwhelmed with work deadlines and final preparations, had gratefully accepted the offer. She should have known better. As Natasha sat in her childhood bedroom on the morning of her wedding, watching her best friend Chloe curl her hair while her mother bustled around with coffee and encouragement, she felt a mixture of excitement and relief. After months of navigating Dolores's demands and criticism, the day was finally here. Soon she would be married to Ryan, and they could start building their life together in the house she loved. She had no idea that downstairs, hanging in her closet, was a dress that would change everything. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The morning sun streamed through the lace curtains of Natasha's childhood bedroom as she finished her coffee, trying to calm the butterflies in her stomach. In 3 hours, she would walk down the aisle at the Harbor Club, surrounded by family and friends, wearing the dress of her dreams. "All right, bride-to-be," Chloe announced, clapping her hands together. "Time to get you into that gorgeous gown. I still can't believe you found such a perfect Vera Wang piece." Natasha's mother, Patricia, beamed as she headed toward the closet. "I've been dying to see it again. When Dolores brought it over yesterday, she hung it up so carefully and said it was absolutely stunning." Something cold settled in Natasha's stomach. "Wait, what? Dolores brought it here?" "Yes, sweetie. She said she wanted to make sure it was safe and wrinkle-free for today. Such a thoughtful gesture." Patricia's hand reached for the garment bag hanging in the corner of the room. Chloe and Natasha exchanged glances. In the months of wedding planning, Dolores had never once made a thoughtful gesture without an ulterior motive. "Shh, let me see it," Natasha said, her voice sharper than she intended. Patricia unzipped the garment bag with ceremony, her smile beginning to fade as she pulled back the protective covering. What emerged was not the elegant Vera Wang creation that had made Natasha feel like a princess. Instead, hanging before them was a dress that looked like it had been rescued from a costume box. The fabric was a dull, yellowed ivory that had clearly seen better days. The bodice was ill-fitting, with visible wear marks, and the skirt was made of cheap polyester that crinkled when touched. Fake pearl buttons hung loosely from threads that were already coming undone, and the hemline was uneven, as if it had been altered by someone who had never held a needle before. This isn't my dress," Natasha whispered, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch the inferior fabric. "This isn't my dress." Patricia's face went pale. "But Dolores said, she assured me this was the dress from the salon. She said you decided to go with something more appropriate for a Harbor Town wedding." The words hit Natasha like a physical blow. More appropriate. She could practically hear Dolores's voice dripping with false concern as she delivered that line. Chloe grabbed the garment bag and shook it, looking for any sign that this was a mistake, that maybe the real dress was folded inside. But there was nothing except a small tag hanging from the sleeve of the imposter dress. Goodwill, 1999. "She switched it," Natasha said, her voice barely above a whisper. She actually switched my wedding dress with a thrift store dress. The reality of what had happened crashed over her in waves. While she'd been working late, finalizing contracts, and trusting her future mother-in-law to handle one simple task, Dolores had been planning this sabotage. She'd taken the dress that Natasha had saved for, chosen carefully, and loved completely, and replaced it with something designed to humiliate her on the most important day of her life. "Call her," Patricia said, reaching for her phone. "Call her right now. This has to be a mistake."
But even as her mother dialed Dolores's number, Natasha knew it wasn't a mistake. This was exactly what Dolores had intended. This was her way of putting Natasha in her place on her wedding day, of making sure everyone at the Harbor Club could see that Ryan's bride wasn't quite as sophisticated as she pretended to be. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before Dolores answered with a voice that sounded entirely too cheerful. "Patricia, how lovely to hear from you on this beautiful wedding morning. I hope everything is going smoothly." "Dolores," Patricia said, trying to keep her voice steady, "there seems to be some confusion about Natasha's dress. The one in the garment bag isn't the Vera Wang gown she ordered." There was a pause, just long enough for Dolores to construct her response. "Oh my goodness, you're absolutely right. I'm so sorry for the confusion. When I went to pick up the dress yesterday, the salon explained that there had been a problem with the original gown. Something about damaged beadwork during the final alterations. They offered this lovely replacement instead, and I thought Natasha would appreciate not having to worry about last-minute dress shopping." The lie was so smooth, so perfectly delivered, that for a moment even Natasha almost believed it. Almost. They said the replacement was from the same designer collection and that it would be much more suitable for an outdoor harbor ceremony. I hope I didn't overstep, but there simply wasn't time to consult with Natasha, and I wanted to save her the stress. Chloe grabbed the phone from Patricia's hand. "Dolores, this is Chloe. I was with Natasha at her final fitting 4 days ago. The dress was perfect. There was no damage, no problems, nothing that would require a replacement." Another pause. "Well, dear, I can only tell you what the salon told me. Perhaps there was some miscommunication, but it's much too late to do anything about it now. The wedding is in 3 hours, and I'm sure Natasha will look lovely regardless of what she's wearing." The dismissal in her tone was unmistakable. This wasn't about saving Natasha stress or preventing last-minute problems. This was about control, about making sure that on her wedding day, Natasha knew exactly where she stood in the Caldwell family hierarchy. "Where is my actual dress?" Natasha asked, taking the phone from Chloe. "I have no idea, dear. I assume it's still at the salon being repaired. You could call them on Monday if you'd like to follow up, but really, dwelling on these details seems unnecessarily dramatic for such a happy day." Unnecessarily dramatic. There it was, the implication that Natasha was being unreasonable, that caring about her wedding dress was somehow shallow or inappropriate. "I'll call the salon myself," Natasha said. "Of course, sweetheart, though I should mention that they're closed today for a family emergency. Something about the owner's mother being hospitalized. Such a shame, but these things happen." Even through her anger, Natasha had to admire the thoroughness of Dolores's planning. She thought of everything, covered every base, made sure there would be no way to fix this situation before the ceremony. After hanging up, the 3 women stood in silence, staring at the dress that seemed to mock them from its hanger. Outside, cars were already arriving for the wedding. The caterers would be setting up at the Harbor Club. The flowers had been delivered. The guests were getting ready. And Natasha was supposed to walk down the aisle in a $20 thrift store dress that didn't fit, didn't match her vision, and clearly been chosen to humiliate her in front of everyone she cared about. "We have to do something," Chloe said finally. "We can't let her get away with this." But what could they do? Every bridal shop in town would be closed on a Saturday, and even if they weren't, there was no time to find, alter, and deliver a new dress. Dolores had timed this perfectly, ensuring that Natasha would have no choice but to accept the humiliation or call off the wedding entirely. As Natasha looked at her reflection in the bedroom mirror, still in her robe with her hair half finished, she realized that this wasn't just about a dress. This was about respect, about boundaries, about what her life was going to be like if she married into a family where the matriarch felt entitled to sabotage her happiness whenever she felt like asserting dominance. The question wasn't whether she could find another dress in the next 3 hours. The question was whether she was going to let Dolores Caldwell set the tone for the rest of her life. Natasha stared at the offensive dress for a full minute before something shifted inside her. The tears she'd been fighting back dried up, replaced by a cold, calculating anger that reminded her why she'd never lost a case in court. "Mom, call Ryan," she said quietly, her voice taking on the same tone she used when delivering closing arguments. "Tell him I need to see him right now, alone." Patricia hesitated. "Sweetie, you know it's bad luck for the groom to see the bride before—" "Mom." Natasha's voice cut through the superstition with surgical precision. "Call him. Now." While Patricia dialed, Natasha walked to her laptop, still open on her childhood desk where she'd been reviewing some documents the night before. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, pulling up files she'd organized months ago but hoped she'd never need. Chloe watched her with growing curiosity. "Tash, what are you doing?" "Research," Natasha replied, scrolling through documents. "I'm a lawyer, Chloe. When someone tries to play games with me, I make sure I know exactly what I'm dealing with." 20 minutes later, Ryan knocked on the bedroom door, looking handsome in his charcoal gray suit, but visibly confused about why he'd been summoned. His hair was perfectly styled, his boutonniere was pinned straight, and he had the easy confidence of a man who thought the worst of his problems was remembering his vows. "Babe, what's going on? My mom said there was some kind of emergency with your dress, but she said it was all sorted out. She mentioned the salon had to make a last-minute substitution, but—" "Ryan," Natasha interrupted, gesturing toward the garment bag. "Look at it." He unzipped the bag and blinked at the contents, his brow furrowing as he tried to process what he was seeing. This isn't the dress you showed me pictures of." "No, it's not. Your mother switched my $3,000 Vera Wang gown with a $20 thrift store dress. She lied about problems at the salon, timed it so I couldn't fix it, and fully intends for me to walk down the aisle in this thing so that everyone at our wedding can see how inappropriate my original choice was." Ryan's face went through several expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally a resigned recognition that suggested this wasn't the first time his mother had pulled something like this. "Look, I'm sure there's an explanation. Maybe she was trying to help and just made a mistake. You know how she gets when she's stressed." "Stop." Natasha held up a hand. "Just stop right there. I need you to listen to me very carefully, because what happens in the next 5 minutes is going to determine whether we're getting married today or not." The seriousness in her tone seemed to finally penetrate Ryan's reflexive defense of his mother. He sat down on the edge of the bed, his hands clasped in front of him. "Your mother didn't make a mistake," Natasha continued. "She made a choice. She chose to humiliate me on our wedding day because she's never accepted that I'm going to be your wife. And you know what? I can live with having a difficult mother-in-law. What I can't live with is having a husband who won't stand up for me when I'm being deliberately hurt." "Natasha, that's not fair. You're asking me to choose between you and my mother." "No, Ryan. I'm asking you to choose between right and wrong. I'm asking you to acknowledge what she did was cruel and unacceptable, and that you're going to make it clear to her that it will never happen again." Ryan ran his hands through his perfectly styled hair, leaving it slightly mussed. "She's grieving, Tash. Since Dad died, she's been lost. Sometimes she doesn't think clearly about how her actions affect other people. She thought clearly enough to plan this entire scheme. She thought clearly enough to lie about the salon being closed. She thought clearly enough to time it so I'd have no recourse. This wasn't grief, Ryan. This was calculated cruelty." The silence stretched between them for nearly a minute. Outside, Natasha could hear the sounds of wedding preparations continuing. car doors slamming, voices calling greetings, the distant sound of the string quartet tuning their instruments at the Harbor Club. Finally, Ryan spoke. "What do you want me to do? The wedding is in 2 hours. There's no time to find another dress, and we can't disappoint all these people who've traveled here for us." And there it was. The response that told Natasha everything she needed to know. Not, "How can I fix this?" or "What my mother did was unforgivable." Instead, it was about logistics, about not disappointing people, about finding a way to make this work, rather than addressing the fundamental problem. "You're right," Natasha said quietly. "We can't disappoint all these people. So here's what's going to happen." She opened her laptop and turned the screen toward him. "I've been doing some research over the past few months. Just due diligence on the family I was marrying into." On the screen was a property record showing the rental agreement for Dolores's current address. Ryan glanced at it, still not understanding why she was showing him real estate documents. "Your mother has been telling everyone that you're going to inherit your father's house when you get married. She's been dropping hints to our friends, mentioning it to the wedding photographer today as an explanation for why we can afford such an elaborate reception."
Ryan shifted uncomfortably. "Yeah, well, she's proud. She wants people to know we're doing well." "Except there is no inheritance, is there, Ryan? Because your father mortgaged that house to the hilt before he died, and it was foreclosed on 3 years ago. Your mother's been living in a rental property that costs $1,800 a month, which is more than she can afford on her Social Security." The color drained from Ryan's face. "How did you—" "I'm a real estate attorney, remember? Property records are public information, and credit reports are available to anyone with legitimate business interest." Natasha pulled up another document. "She's 3 months behind on rent. Her landlord has already filed eviction proceedings." She turned the laptop screen toward him so he could see the official notice that would be served any day now. "Your mother is about to be homeless, Ryan, and instead of asking for help, instead of being honest about her situation, she's been spending her time trying to humiliate me." Ryan stared at the documents, his face cycling through emotions too quickly for Natasha to track. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because I want you to understand exactly what we're dealing with. Your mother isn't just difficult or grief-stricken, she's desperate and scared, and she's taking it out on me because it's easier than facing her own problems. And you've been enabling it by refusing to see her behavior for what it really is." Natasha closed the laptop and stood up, smoothing down her robe. "So here's my decision. I'm going to put on this ridiculous dress, and I'm going to walk down that aisle, and I'm going to marry you. But not because I'm willing to accept being treated this way." She moved to her dresser and pulled out a manila envelope that she'd prepared weeks ago but hoped she'd never have to use. "During the reception, when your mother inevitably makes some comment about how appropriate my dress choice was, or when she starts telling people about the house you're going to inherit, I'm going to very publicly correct the record." Ryan's eyes widened as he saw the official documents in her hands. "Natasha, you can't." "I can, and I will. Because if we're going to be married, we're going to start with honesty. No more pretending your mother's behavior is acceptable. No more letting her lies stand unchallenged. And no more putting her feelings ahead of basic respect for your wife." She tucked the envelope into her makeup bag, her movements deliberate and controlled. "Your mother wants to play games? Fine. But she's going to learn that I'm much better at this than she is." Ryan stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the harbor. "This is our wedding day, Tosh. It's supposed to be about love and new beginnings, not revenge plots." "You're absolutely right," Natasha agreed. "It should be about love and new beginnings, but your mother made sure it was going to be about power and humiliation instead. I'm just changing the target." She sat down at her vanity and began applying her makeup with steady hands. "You have a choice to make, Ryan. You can support me in setting boundaries with your mother, or you can continue enabling her behavior. But you can't do both, and you can't protect her from the consequences of her actions forever." In the mirror, she could see Ryan struggling with the decision, his reflection wavering between the man she'd fallen in love with and the boy who'd never learned to stand up to his mother. "What happens after today?" he asked finally. "It depends entirely on you,"
Natasha replied, applying lipstick with the precision of someone preparing for battle. "But I'll tell you this much. I'm never going to let anyone treat me the way your mother treated me today. Not her, not anyone else, and not you." The weight of her words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Outside, the wedding guests were beginning to arrive at the Harbor Club, unaware that the bride was preparing for a very different kind of ceremony than they'd been invited to witness. Natasha looked at her reflection one more time, seeing not the humiliated victim Dolores had intended to create, but a woman who was about to teach everyone present a lesson about the cost of underestimating her. "Now," she said, standing up and reaching for the offensive dress, "help me into this thing. I have a wedding to attend." Getting into the thrift store dress was like putting on armor of humiliation. The fabric felt rough against her skin, and the bodice hung loose in all the wrong places while pulling tight across her ribs. The zipper caught halfway up, requiring Chloe to work it free with soap, and the hemline fell unevenly around her ankles, giving her the appearance of someone who had grabbed the first thing available at a costume shop.
But as Patricia fastened the last of the mismatched buttons, and Chloe attempted to arrange the wrinkled skirt into something resembling bridal elegance, Natasha felt something unexpected settling over her, a cold, calculated determination that she recognized from her most challenging court cases. "You know what?" she said, examining herself in the full-length mirror. "This is perfect." Chloe looked at her as if she'd lost her mind. "Cash, you don't have to pretend it's okay. This is horrible, and everyone's going to know—" "Exactly." Natasha turned away from the mirror, her eyes bright with something that wasn't quite revenge but wasn't forgiveness either. "Everyone's going to know. They're going to see this dress and they're going to wonder what happened. And when they start asking questions, they're going to get answers." She moved to her jewelry box and selected the diamond necklace her grandmother had left her, a piece that had more value than the dress, shoes, and veil combined. The contrast was jarring and entirely intentional. "Mom, I need you to do something for me," Natasha said, fastening the necklace herself when her hands proved steadier than Patricia's trembling fingers. "When people ask about the dress, and they will ask, I want you to tell them exactly what happened. Don't cover for Dolores. Don't make excuses. Just tell the truth." Patricia looked uncertain. "Sweetheart, are you sure? Starting your marriage with family drama?" "The drama already started," Natasha interrupted gently. "Dolores made sure of that when she decided to sabotage my wedding day. I'm just deciding how it's going to end." She picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she was looking for. Dr. Amanda Foster, a friend from law school who now ran a boutique legal consulting firm in Boston. "Natasha, shouldn't you be getting married right about now?" "In 40 minutes, Natasha confirmed, gesturing for Chloe to start packing her makeup bag. "Amanda, I need a favor. Remember that property management company you work with? The one that handles difficult eviction cases? Whitmore and Associates? Sure, why?" "I'm going to email you some documents in about 5 minutes. I need you to verify something for me and possibly make a phone call." There was a pause. "Natasha, what's going on? You sound like you're in court mode." "Just trust me on this. Can you do it?" "Of course. Send me whatever you need." Natasha hung up and quickly forwarded the eviction documents she'd found, along with a brief explanation of what she needed verified. Her fingers moved across the phone screen with the efficiency of someone who'd spent years managing legal crises under pressure. "Tash," Chloe said carefully, "what exactly are you planning?" "I'm planning to get married, and then I'm planning to have a reception where everyone learns exactly what kind of person they're celebrating." The drive to the Harbor Club took 12 minutes, during which Natasha sat in the passenger seat of her mother's car, reviewing the mental notes she'd been compiling about Dolores's behavior over the past 8 months. Every passive-aggressive comment, every undermining suggestion, every moment when Ryan had chosen to placate his mother rather than support his fiancée, it all formed a pattern that was about to become very public.
The Harbor Club sat on a bluff overlooking Millbrook Harbor, its white columns and wraparound porches designed to evoke the grand hotels of a bygone era. Under normal circumstances, Natasha would have been thrilled to be married at such a beautiful venue. Today, it felt like walking into a courtroom where she was about to deliver the most important closing argument of her career. As they pulled into the circular drive, Natasha could see the wedding guests milling about on the lawn, champagne glasses in hand, taking advantage of the unseasonably warm October weather. She spotted several of her law firm colleagues, Ryan's co-workers from the medical equipment company, neighbors from Elm Street, and family members who had traveled from 3 different states to celebrate what they believed would be a joyous occasion. "Last chance to reconsider this approach," Patricia said softly, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she watched the photographer setting up for pre-ceremony shots. "There's nothing to reconsider," Natasha replied, checking her lipstick in the visor mirror. "Dolores made a choice this morning. I'm just making mine." She stepped out of the car and immediately felt the weight of dozens of eyes turning in her direction. The conversations didn't stop exactly, but they definitely shifted, voices dropping to whispers as guests tried to process what they were seeing. Mrs. Henley from the flower shop was the first to approach, her face a careful mask of politeness that didn't quite hide her confusion. "Natasha, dear, what an interesting choice for your gown." "Thank you, Mrs. Henley. It's certainly not what I originally planned to wear." The older woman's eyebrows rose slightly, clearly hoping for more information, but Natasha simply smiled and moved toward the bridal suite that had been reserved for final preparations. Inside the small room adjacent to the main hall, she found exactly what she'd expected, a flurry of activity as the wedding coordinator, florist, and photographer made last-minute adjustments. And there, in the center of it all, was Dolores Caldwell, resplendent in a navy blue mother-of-the-groom dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Dolores looked up as Natasha entered, and for just a moment, her carefully composed expression slipped into something that might have been satisfaction. Then, just as quickly, it transformed into concern so artificial it could have been purchased at the same thrift store as the dress. "Oh, Natasha, you certainly look like a bride." The pause before bride was perfectly timed, just long enough to let everyone in the room know that something was off without actually saying anything that could be called rude. "Thank you, Dolores. I think this dress sends exactly the message I want to send today." The wedding coordinator, an efficient woman named Janet, who had been handling Harbor Club events for 15 years, looked between them with the expression of someone who sensed undercurrents but couldn't quite identify them. "Is everything ready for the ceremony?" Natasha asked Janet, her voice perfectly calm and professional. "Absolutely. The musicians are in position, the officiant is ready, and the guests are seated. We're just waiting for your signal." Natasha nodded and turned to check her appearance one last time in the full-length mirror that Janet had positioned near the window. The reflection that stared back at her was startling. The expensive jewelry and professionally styled hair and makeup created a jarring contrast with the cheap, ill-fitting dress that hung on her frame like a costume from a community theater production. "Perfect." "Natasha," she said without turning away from the mirror, "I want to thank you for all your help with the wedding preparations, especially your assistance with my dress situation today." "Oh, it was nothing, dear. I'm just sorry the salon had those last-minute problems with your original gown, but I think this substitute works out beautifully, much more appropriate for a simple Harbor Town ceremony." There it was, the word appropriate, delivered with just enough emphasis to make sure everyone understood that Natasha's original choice had been somehow lacking in judgment or taste. "You're absolutely right," Natasha agreed, still facing the mirror. "This dress is perfect for what I have planned today." Her phone buzzed with a text from Amanda. "Documents verified. Property management confirms eviction proceeding as scheduled. Tenant has 5 days from service of notice. Want me to make that call?" Natasha typed back quickly. Not yet. We'll contact you during the reception. She slipped the phone back into her purse and turned to face the room. I think it's time to get this show started. Janet nodded and spoke into her headset, coordinating with the musicians and officiant. Bridal party, please take your positions. Natasha, your father is waiting in the foyer to walk you down the aisle. As the room began to empty, with bridesmaids gathering their bouquets and the photographer rushing ahead to capture the processional, Dolores lingered behind, clearly savoring what she believed was her victory. You know, dear, she said in the tone she might use to comfort a child who had skinned their knee, marriage is all about compromise and learning to put family harmony ahead of personal preferences. I think you're learning that lesson beautifully today. Natasha picked up her bouquet, white roses and baby's breath that somehow managed to look elegant despite the dress they were paired with, and smiled at her future mother-in-law with genuine warmth. You're absolutely right about marriage requiring lessons, she replied. I think we're all going to learn quite a bit today. As she walked toward the foyer where her father waited, looking handsome and confused in his rented tuxedo, Natasha felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came before delivering a crucial argument in court. The difference was, today she wasn't just fighting for a client. Today she was fighting for her future, her dignity, and her right to be treated with respect by the family she was about to join. And by the time the reception ended, everyone in that room was going to understand exactly what happened when someone tried to humiliate Natasha Reeves on her wedding day. The processional music began, and she took her father's arm, ready to walk down the aisle toward a marriage that was about to start very differently than anyone expected. The doors to the main hall opened, and Natasha stepped into what felt like a scene from a movie, where the soundtrack had been carefully orchestrated to heighten drama. The string quartet's rendition of Pachelbel's canon filled the air, sunlight streamed through the tall windows overlooking the harbor, and 200 guests rose to their feet in perfect unison. For exactly 3 seconds, it was everything she had dreamed her wedding entrance would be.
Then the whispers started. They began in the back rows, a subtle rustling of fabric and turning of heads as guests tried to process what they were seeing. Natasha kept her eyes focused straight ahead on Ryan, who stood at the altar looking devastatingly handsome in his charcoal suit, but she could feel the wave of confusion rippling through the assembled crowd like stones thrown into still water. Her father, Thomas, squeezed her arm gently. "You okay, sweetheart?" he whispered, clearly aware that something was amiss, but not understanding what. "I'm perfect, Dad," she replied, and meant it. Every step down the aisle felt like a small victory, each whispered comment from the guests confirmation that her strategy was working exactly as planned. In the third row, she spotted Ryan's cousin Jennifer frantically texting someone, probably her sister who lived in California and was following the wedding through social media updates. 2 rows behind her, Natasha's colleague from the law firm, Marcus Whitfield, was leaning over to whisper something to his wife, his expression a mixture of confusion and concern. But it was the front row that provided the most interesting reactions. Patricia sat ramrod straight, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. Beside her, Dolores wore an expression of such perfect composure that it was clearly taking significant effort to maintain. Her smile never wavered, but Natasha caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested she was beginning to realize this wasn't going according to plan. Ryan's best man, his college roommate Derek, kept glancing between Ryan and Natasha with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle without all the pieces. The bridesmaids, arranged in their perfectly coordinated sage green dresses, looked like a chorus line that had forgotten their choreography. When Natasha finally reached the altar, Ryan's eyes met hers with a mixture of love and barely concealed panic. He'd clearly spent the time since their conversation that morning trying to convince himself that everything would work out, that somehow the situation would resolve itself without requiring him to take a definitive stand.
"You look beautiful," he whispered as her father lifted her veil and kissed her cheek before taking his seat. "Thank you," she replied, meaning it in a way that had nothing to do with the dress and everything to do with how she felt about what she was about to accomplish. Reverend Morrison, who had officiated at Harbor Club weddings for nearly 2 decades, began the ceremony with his standard opening remarks about love, commitment, and the joining of 2 families. His delivery was smooth and practiced, but Natasha noticed his eyes flickering occasionally to her dress with the barely perceptible confusion of someone who had presided over hundreds of weddings and had never seen a bride wearing something that looked like it had been purchased at a rummage sale. The ceremony proceeded through its traditional paces, the reading from Corinthians about love being patient and kind, the exchange of rings that Ryan's hands trembled slightly while placing on her finger, the recitation of vows that they had written themselves during happier times when they thought their biggest challenge would be choosing between salmon and chicken for the reception dinner. But throughout it all, Natasha was acutely aware of the undercurrent of whispered speculation flowing through the assembled crowd. She could practically hear the mental conversations taking place in the pews behind her. Did something happen to her real dress? Maybe it's a family tradition. Could this be some kind of artistic statement? Surely there's an explanation. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was standing at the altar promising to love, honor, and cherish a man whose mother had spent the morning actively trying to humiliate her, while simultaneously planning to expose that same woman's lies and financial desperation in front of everyone they both knew. When Reverend Morrison reached the part about speaking now or forever holding your peace, Natasha felt a moment of genuine suspense. Part of her almost hoped someone would stand up, if only to break the tension that was building in the room like pressure in a tea kettle. But the moment passed in silence, and they moved into the final exchange of vows. "Ryan, I promise to love you completely, to support your dreams, and to always be honest with you about what I need and expect from our marriage. I promise to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult, and to never let anyone, including family, treat either of us with disrespect." The emphasis on the word anyone was subtle but unmistakable, and she saw Ryan's Adam's apple bob as he swallowed hard before delivering his own vows. "Natasha, I promise to love and protect you, to be the husband you deserve, and to—" He paused, clearly struggling with words that had seemed perfectly adequate when they had practiced them, but now felt inadequate given the morning's events. "To always put our marriage first, no matter what challenges we face."
When Reverend Morrison pronounced them husband and wife and invited Ryan to kiss his bride, the applause from the assembled guests was polite but subdued, lacking the enthusiastic celebration that typically greeted newlyweds. It was the sound of people clapping because they knew they were supposed to, not because they were caught up in the joy of the moment. As they walked back down the aisle together, Natasha caught glimpses of faces in the crowd that told the story of her morning's gamble. Her law school friends looked concerned but supportive, clearly trusting that she had a reason for whatever was happening. Ryan's family members appeared confused and slightly embarrassed, as if they were watching a performance they didn't understand but suspected they should be finding problematic. Mrs. Henderson from the Historical Society, who had known Natasha since she was a teenager volunteering at the library, looked genuinely worried, clearly wondering if financial problems had forced the young lawyer to compromise on her wedding day. Mr. Peterson from the hardware store kept glancing between Natasha and Dolores as if trying to solve a mystery with insufficient clues. But it was the photographers and videographers that interested Natasha most. She could see them working overtime to find flattering angles, to capture the emotion and joy that was supposed to be present at such moments while navigating around the obvious problem of the dress. Their professional challenge was her strategic advantage. Every photo, every video clip would tell the story of this morning's sabotage without her having to say a word. As they exited the ceremony hall and moved toward the cocktail hour on the terrace, Natasha felt Ryan's hand tighten on hers. Are you really going to go through with whatever you're planning? He asked quietly, his smile never wavering for the benefit of the guests who were beginning to follow them outside. That depends entirely on your mother, Natasha replied, adjusting her grip on her bouquet. If she can make it through the cocktail hour without making any comments about my appropriate dress choice or mentioning your supposed inheritance, then maybe we can all just enjoy the reception. They both knew that wasn't going to happen. Dolores had already proven that morning that she couldn't resist the opportunity to twist the knife, and the reception was going to provide her with a captive audience of 200 people and several hours to work with. The question wasn't whether she would make the comments that would trigger Natasha's response. It was when and how spectacularly she would do it. As they stepped onto the terrace where servers were already circulating with champagne and hors d'oeuvres, Natasha spotted Dolores holding court near the raw bar, surrounded by a small group of relatives who were clearly pressing her for information about the dress situation. "She's already starting," Ryan observed, following Natasha's gaze. "Good. The sooner she shows her true colors, the sooner everyone will understand exactly what kind of person we're dealing with." The cocktail hours stretched ahead of them like the calm before a storm, filled with congratulations from guests who were clearly struggling to find appropriate comments about the bride's appearance, and small talk that danced carefully around the obvious question that everyone was too polite to ask directly. But Natasha could feel the momentum building toward the inevitable confrontation. Every whispered conversation, every curious glance, every moment of Dolores's growing confidence was adding fuel to the fire that was about to consume the careful facade she'd built around her relationship with her new daughter-in-law. The reception dinner was still 2 hours away, but Natasha was already counting down the minutes until she could deliver the closing argument that would change everything. The cocktail hour unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance of social politeness, with guests navigating between genuine celebration and barely concealed curiosity about the bride's unusual attire. The Harbor Club's terrace provided the perfect backdrop. White linens fluttering in the ocean breeze, the distant sound of sailboat rigging chiming like wind chimes, and the golden afternoon light casting everything in the kind of warm light that wedding photographers dream about. For the first 30 minutes, it seemed as though the situation might stabilize itself through sheer force of good manners. Guests approached Natasha and Ryan with congratulations that carefully avoided any mention of her appearance, focusing instead on safe topics like the beautiful venue, the perfect weather, and how happy they looked together. "Such a lovely ceremony," gushed Mrs. Adelaide Fairfax, an elderly woman who had taught piano lessons to half the children in Millbrook Harbor over the past 40 decades. "And what an interesting choice for your gown, dear. So unique." "Thank you, Mrs. Fairfax. I thought it sent exactly the right message for today." "Oh, well, yes, I'm sure it did." The older woman's smile remained fixed, but her eyes held the confused expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle without all the necessary pieces.
Similar conversations played out across the terrace as Natasha moved through the crowd with Ryan at her side, accepting congratulations and deflecting questions with responses that were truthful without being explanatory. She was beginning to think that perhaps Dolores might actually exercise some restraint, that maybe the public nature of the setting would encourage her to keep her opinions to herself. That optimism lasted exactly 43 minutes. Natasha was standing near the harbor-facing railing, listening to Ryan's college roommate Derek tell a story about their fraternity days, when she heard Dolores's voice rise above the general conversation in that particular tone that meant she was about to hold court. "Oh, you're so kind to say so," Dolores was saying to a cluster of relatives who had traveled from Ryan's father's side of the family. "I do think the ceremony was beautiful, despite let's just say despite the unexpected changes to our original plans." Natasha felt Ryan tense beside her, but she simply smiled and continued listening to Derek's story while keeping one ear tuned to her new mother-in-law's performance. "You see," Dolores continued, her voice carrying just far enough to ensure that several nearby conversation groups could overhear, "there was a terrible mix-up with Natasha's original dress.
some kind of problem at the salon, damaged beadwork or something of that nature. I tried to help by arranging a replacement, but you know how these things go with such short notice. Aunt Millicent, Ryan's father's sister, made appropriate sympathetic noises. Oh my, how stressful that must have been for the poor dear. Well, I did my best to find something appropriate, Dolores replied, the word appropriate delivered with just enough emphasis to suggest that Natasha's original choice had been anything but. Though I have to say, I think this worked out for the best. Much more suitable for a simple harbor town wedding. Not everyone needs to spend a fortune on a dress they'll only wear once. There it was, the implication that Natasha's original choice had been pretentious and wasteful, delivered with the kind of false concern that made it impossible to challenge without seeming ungrateful. "You're such a thoughtful mother-in-law," cooed Cousin Beverly from Portland. "Not everyone would have stepped in to help like that." "Oh, well, family takes care of family," Dolores replied with practiced modesty. "And speaking of family, we're all so excited about the house that Ryan and Natasha will be settling into. Ryan's father left us such a beautiful property, Victorian era, right here in town with harbor views. It's been in the Caldwell family for generations." Natasha's hand tightened on her champagne flute. There it was. The fabrication about the inheritance, delivered to an audience that would certainly spread the story throughout the reception and beyond. "How wonderful!" Aunt Millicent exclaimed. "There's nothing like staying in the family home. Such history, such tradition." "Exactly," Dolores agreed, and I could practically hear the satisfaction in her voice. "Though I have to say, it's things like this that—"
The condescension in that statement was breathtaking in its scope and precision. In just a few sentences, Dolores had managed to establish herself as the generous benefactor, position Ryan as the inheritor of family wealth, and paint Natasha as a social climber who needed guidance to understand proper behavior. "But she's learning," Dolores continued with false warmth. "Today's dress situation is a perfect example. Her original choice was quite ambitious. But sometimes life teaches us that simpler is better, that we don't always need the most expensive option to look appropriate." Natasha felt a strange sense of admiration for the performance, even as it enraged her. Dolores had managed to tell her version of the morning's events in a way that painted herself as the helpful mother-in-law who had saved the day when the pretentious bride's expensive plans fell through. The narrative was cohesive, believable, and designed to generate sympathy for Dolores while positioning Natasha as someone who needed to learn humility. "I should probably go over there," Ryan said quietly, clearly struggling with the decision. "No," Natasha replied, her voice calm but firm. "Let her finish. Let everyone hear exactly what she has to say. Let her really commit to the story." "But she's making you look—" "She's making herself look exactly like what she is. Trust me, Ryan, I know what I'm doing." Across the terrace, Dolores was now discussing the family's long history in Millbrook Harbor, weaving a tale of Caldwell prominence that painted them as pillars of the community who had always understood the importance of maintaining proper appearances and family values. Ryan's father was so respected in this town. He served on the Harbor Commission for 15 years, and everyone knew they could count on the Caldwell family to set an example. That's the kind of legacy we're passing down to the next generation. The group around her murmured appreciatively, clearly impressed by this picture of established family prominence and traditional values. Some of the guests who had been puzzled by Natasha's dress were beginning to nod with understanding, as if Dolores's explanation had provided context that made everything make sense. Natasha watched it all with detached fascination of someone observing a masterclass in manipulation. Dolores had taken the morning's sabotage and transformed it into a teaching moment about humility and appropriate behavior. She'd invented a family legacy that positioned her as the keeper of tradition and Ryan as the inheritor of substantial wealth. Most impressively, she'd done it all while maintaining the appearance of being supportive and helpful. It was, Natasha had to admit, a remarkably skilled performance, which was going to make its destruction all the more satisfying.
Ladies and gentlemen, the wedding coordinator's voice echoed across the terrace through a discreet sound system. Dinner is now being served in the main dining room. Please make your way inside and find your assigned seats. The cocktail hour was ending, and the guests began to move toward the dining room with the relaxed contentment of people who felt they understood the situation and were ready to enjoy the celebration. Dolores walked among them with the satisfied air of someone who had successfully managed a delicate social situation. Natasha linked her arm through Ryan's and smiled at him with genuine warmth. "Ready for dinner, husband?" "Are you really going to do this?" he asked one more time. "Your mother just spent 40 minutes lying to everyone we know. She's told them I'm a social climber who needed her help to learn appropriate behavior and that you're inheriting a $500,000 family home. She's painted herself as the generous benefactor and family matriarch who saved the day when my pretentious plans fell through." She paused to let that sink in. "So yes, Ryan, I'm really going to do this, because someone needs to tell these people the truth." As they walked toward the dining room, Natasha felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came before delivering a closing argument in a case she knew she was going to win. The pieces were all in place, the audience was assembled, and her opponent had just finished providing all the ammunition she needed for complete victory. Dinner was about to be served, and with it, a lesson that would be remembered long after the last guest went home.
The salad course was served with clockwork precision by the Harbor Club's experienced waitstaff, and conversation resumed its pleasant hum as guests settled into the rhythm of a formal dinner. Natasha noticed that several people kept glancing in her direction, clearly still processing the morning's wardrobe situation, but the explanations Dolores had provided during cocktail hour seemed to have satisfied most curiosities. At the Caldwell family table, Dolores was holding court with renewed confidence, her voice carrying just loudly enough for neighboring tables to overhear selected portions of her commentary. Of course, the adjustment period can be difficult for young women who aren't used to family traditions, she was saying to Aunt Millicent while carefully cutting her salad. But I think today shows that Natasha is learning to be more realistic about what's appropriate for our family's position in the community. Cousin Beverly nodded sagely. It's so important to have guidance from someone with experience. Not everyone grows up understanding these social nuances. Exactly, Dolores agreed, dabbing her lips with her napkin. And really, once they're settled in the family house, I think she'll come to appreciate the security that comes with established wealth, rather than always striving for flashy displays. Natasha felt Ryan's leg bump against hers under the table, a nervous habit he'd developed whenever he was stressed. She reached over and placed her hand on his, feeling the tension in his fingers. "You could still stop this," he whispered, leaning closer under the pretense of sharing an intimate moment. "We could just let it go, enjoy our wedding, deal with family issues privately later." "Listen to her, Ryan," Natasha whispered back, her smile never wavering for the benefit of their audience. "She's not just lying about this morning. She's creating an entire false narrative about who we are, where we come from, and what our future looks like. How many people in this room are going to leave tonight believing your family owns a $500,000 inheritance property?" Before Ryan could answer, the sound of silverware tapping against crystal rang out across the dining room. Derek, Ryan's best man, was standing at the head table with his champagne glass raised and a slightly nervous expression on his face. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention for a moment, I'd like to propose a toast to the happy couple." The room quieted as guests turned their attention to the head table, champagne glasses rising in anticipation. Natasha felt her heart rate increase slightly, not from nerves, but from the same focused intensity she experienced when approaching the climax of a particularly important cross-examination.
Derek launched into a warm, humorous speech about Ryan's college years, their friendship, and his joy at seeing his best friend find happiness with someone as accomplished and intelligent as Natasha. It was exactly the kind of toast that wedding guests expected, personal enough to be meaningful, general enough to avoid embarrassment, and delivered with just the right balance of humor and sentiment. But as Derek spoke, Natasha noticed that Dolores's attention wasn't focused on the speech. Instead, she was using the moment when all eyes were on the head table to continue her quiet commentary to the relatives surrounding her. "Such a lovely young man," she murmured about Derek. "He and Ryan have been friends since college. Of course, Derek comes from a very good family himself. His father owns a chain of medical supply companies. It's so important for young people to maintain connections with others who understand the responsibilities that come with family wealth." The audacity of it took Natasha's breath away. Even during someone else's toast, Dolores couldn't resist the opportunity to reinforce her fabricated narrative about the Caldwell family's financial status and social position. Derek concluded his speech to warm applause, and guests began to settle back into dinner conversation. That's when Uncle Harold, Ryan's father's brother who had driven up from Boston for the wedding, decided to contribute his own perspective to the family table discussion. "You know, Dolores, I have to say I'm impressed by how well you've managed everything since Robert passed. Maintaining that beautiful family property, helping Ryan establish himself. It can't be easy as a widow, but you've really preserved the family legacy." Natasha saw Dolores's face flush slightly at the unexpected praise, clearly enjoying the recognition of her supposed accomplishments. "Oh, Harold, you're too kind," she replied with practiced modesty. "But you know how important family legacy is to me. Robert worked so hard to build something lasting for Ryan, and I've just been trying to honor that by making sure he understands the value of what he's inheriting." Uncle Harold nodded approvingly. "That house alone must be worth quite a bit in today's market. Harborfront Victorian properties are getting harder and harder to find." "Well, I don't like to discuss money at social occasions," Dolores said with the air of someone who was about to discuss money at a social occasion, "but our realtor estimates it at around $500,000, possibly more given the recent improvements to the harbor district."
That was it, the moment Natasha had been waiting for. She stood up slowly, her movement causing a ripple of attention to spread across the dining room as guests noticed the bride rising during dinner. Conversations began to fade as people turned to see if she was about to make a speech or announcement. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Natasha said, her voice carrying clearly across the room without needing to be raised, "but I couldn't help but overhear the conversation about family property and inheritance." A complete silence fell over the dining room. Even the waitstaff paused in their duties, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Dolores looked up at her with an expression that was trying to project confidence, but was betrayed by the slight widening of her eyes, the look of someone who had just realized they might have made a tactical error. "I think there might be some confusion about the Caldwell family real estate situation," Natasha continued, reaching into her small clutch purse and withdrawing the manila envelope she'd prepared that morning. "And since so many of our friends and family are here tonight, this seems like the perfect opportunity to clear things up." Ryan's hand shot out to grab her wrist, but she gently pulled away, her smile remaining perfectly composed. "You see," she said, opening the envelope with deliberate care, "as a real estate attorney, I always do my due diligence on property matters, and when Dolores mentioned the family inheritance to so many people tonight, I thought it might be helpful to share the actual facts about the situation." The silence in the room was so complete that the sound of paper rustling seemed amplified as Natasha withdrew several official documents. The Caldwell family home that Dolores has been describing was actually foreclosed upon 3 years ago due to unpaid mortgage payments.
Natasha announced, her voice maintaining the same calm professional tone she used in court. The property was sold at auction and is now owned by a developer who's converting it into luxury condominiums. A collective intake of breath rippled through the dining room. Uncle Harold's champagne glass stopped halfway to his lips, and Cousin Beverly's fork clattered against her plate. Furthermore, Natasha continued, holding up another document, Dolores currently lives in a rental property at 247 Maple Street, where she is currently 3 months behind on rent and facing eviction proceedings that were filed last Tuesday. The color drained from Dolores's face so completely that she looked like she might faint. Several guests at her table reached out instinctively as if to steady her, but she remained frozen in her chair. In fact, Natasha said, producing the final piece of paper, the eviction notice is scheduled to be served this coming Monday, giving Dolores exactly 5 days to vacate the premises or face legal action from her landlord. The silence that followed was deafening. 200 guests sat in stunned stillness, trying to process the complete reversal of everything they'd been told during the cocktail hour. The elegant fairy tale reception had transformed into something else entirely, a courtroom where the defendant had just been caught in a devastating lie. Dolores finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. You can't. This is my son's wedding reception." "Yes, it is," Natasha agreed brightly, "which is why I thought it was so important to make sure everyone understood the truth about our family situation. After all, you spent the cocktail hour explaining to everyone how important honesty and family values are to the Caldwells." She looked out over the room of shocked faces, her expression remaining perfectly calm and reasonable. "I hope this clears up any confusion about inheritance properties or family wealth. As you can see, Ryan and I will be making our own way in the world, just like most young couples do." The devastating silence stretched on as guests struggled to process not just the revelation itself, but the calculated precision with which it had been delivered. Dolores sat motionless, her carefully constructed facade crumbling like a house of cards in a hurricane, while the weight of her exposed lies settled over the reception like a heavy blanket. Natasha carefully returned the documents to their envelope and took her seat, reaching for her champagne glass as if nothing unusual had happened at all. "Now," she said brightly, "I believe the main course should be served soon. I heard the salmon is supposed to be exceptional." The silence that followed Natasha's revelation lasted exactly 47 seconds. Long enough for the magnitude of what had just happened to sink into every corner of the dining room, but short enough that it felt like an eternity to everyone present. Then the dam broke. It started with a single champagne glass being set down too hard on a table, the sharp clink echoing like a gunshot in the stillness. Then came the whispers, a low buzz of conversation that spread through the room like wildfire as guests turned to each other with expressions of shock, confusion, and dawning understanding.
At the Caldwell family table, the reaction was immediate and catastrophic. Uncle Harold sat with his mouth slightly open, staring at Dolores as if seeing her for the first time. Cousin Beverly had gone pale, her hand pressed to her chest as she struggled to process the complete reversal of everything she'd been told. Aunt Millicent, ever the diplomat, looked between Dolores and Natasha with the expression of someone trying to find a way to smooth over an unsmoothable situation. But it was Dolores herself who commanded the most attention. She remained frozen in her chair for nearly a full minute, her face cycling through a range of emotions so rapidly that it was like watching time-lapse photography of a storm system. Shock gave way to panic, panic to humiliation, and humiliation to something that looked dangerously close to rage. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but the acoustics of the dining room carried it to every corner. You planned this. You brought those papers to your own wedding?" "Yes, I did," Natasha replied calmly, taking a sip of her champagne. Just like you planned to sabotage my dress this morning. The difference is that my plan involved telling the truth." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Suddenly, the strange dress situation made perfect sense to everyone present. The pieces fell into place with an almost audible click as guests realized that they had been witnessing not a fashion mishap or family tradition, but a deliberate act of sabotage that had been expertly turned back on its perpetrator. Ryan, who had been sitting in stunned silence beside his new wife, finally found his voice. "Natasha, please, can we not do this here?" "Where exactly should we do it, Ryan?" she asked, turning to face him with an expression that was perfectly calm, but somehow more frightening than anger would have been. "In private, where your mother can continue to lie and manipulate? In a year or two, when she's told this story so many times that everyone believes it? Or should we do it right here, right now, in front of everyone who heard her spend the cocktail hour lying about our family's financial situation?" She gestured toward the room full of guests, many of whom were now openly staring at their table. Every person in this room now understands exactly what happened this morning. They know that your mother deliberately sabotaged my wedding dress because she wanted to humiliate me. They know that she's been lying about family inheritance and property ownership. They know that instead of being honest about her financial problems and asking for help, she chose to spend her time trying to destroy my happiness. Ryan's face was ashen. "But you've humiliated her in front of our entire family, our friends, everyone we know." "I've told the truth in front of our entire family, our friends, and everyone we know," Natasha corrected. "Your mother humiliated herself by choosing to lie about everything, from her living situation to her motivations for switching my dress." At the family table, the fallout was accelerating. Uncle Harold had pushed back his chair and was leaning away from Dolores, as if physical distance could somehow protect him from association with her deception. "Dolores," he said quietly, "is this true? Are you really facing eviction?" Dolores's composure finally cracked completely. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising to a pitch that carried across the dining room. "She has everything. She has a career, her house, her perfect life. She didn't need a perfect wedding dress, too. She didn't need to spend $3,000 on something she'll wear once when there are people struggling just to keep a roof over their heads." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a fire, confirming not only the truth of Natasha's revelations, but also revealing the bitter resentment that had motivated the morning's sabotage. "So, you thought you'd teach me a lesson about gratitude by ruining my wedding day?" Natasha asked, her voice still maddeningly calm. "You thought you'd show me the value of humility by forcing me to wear a thrift store dress in front of 200 people? You needed to learn," Dolores began, but her voice broke on the words. "You needed to learn what exactly? That my financial success somehow obligates me to accept being treated with disrespect? That because I can afford nice things, I don't deserve to have them? That your financial problems give you the right to sabotage my happiness?" The questions hit their target with surgical precision, and Dolores seemed to shrimp in her chair with each one. Around the dining room, conversations had resumed, in earnest, as guests processed the dramatic turn of events, but the focus remained on the family table, where a relationship was disintegrating in real time. Patricia, Natasha's mother, who had been sitting in stunned silence at the parents' table, finally stood up and walked over to where her daughter sat. "Sweetheart," she said quietly, "are you okay?"
It was such a simple question, but it seemed to pierce through Natasha's courtroom composure in a way that all of Dolores's dramatics had not. For the first time since the morning's dress discovery, she felt the weight of what this day had cost her settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. "I'm fine, Mom," she said, but her voice carried a weariness that hadn't been there moments before. "I'm just tired of pretending that what happened this morning was acceptable." Chloe, who had been watching from the bridal party table with a mixture of horror and admiration, approached the head table with the determined stride of someone who had decided to take action. "You know what?" she announced loudly enough for several nearby tables to hear. "I think it's time we talked about what actually happened this morning, since apparently some people are still confused about the facts." "Chloe," Natasha warned, but her best friend was already in motion. "This morning," Chloe declared, turning to address the room like a prosecutor delivering closing arguments, "Dolores Caldwell deliberately took Natasha's $3,000 Vera Wang wedding gown from the bridal salon and replaced it with a $20 thrift store dress. She then lied about problems at the salon, ensuring that Natasha would have no time to fix the situation before the ceremony." A collective gasp rose from tables that hadn't quite grasped the full scope of the morning's events. The brutality of the sabotage, laid out in such stark terms, seemed to shock even guests who had already understood the basic situation. "She did this," she continued, turning to address the room like a prosecutor delivering closing arguments, "because she resented Natasha's success and wanted to humiliate her on her wedding day. And then she spent the cocktail hour telling everyone that Natasha had made inappropriate choices and needed guidance about what was suitable for a simple harbor town wedding." The room erupted in a buzz of conversation as this final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Guests who had accepted Dolores's explanation during cocktail hour now realized they had been manipulated into participating in the humiliation of the bride. Mrs. Fairfax, the elderly piano teacher, stood up slowly from her table and walked over to where Dolores sat. In a voice that carried the authority of someone who had taught proper behavior to generations of children, she said, "Dolores Caldwell, I have never, in my 73 years, witnessed such deliberate cruelty at a wedding reception. You should be ashamed of yourself." The public rebuke from one of the town's most respected residents seemed to break whatever remained of Dolores's composure. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that made several people wince. "I won't sit here and be lectured by people who don't understand what it's like to lose everything. What it's like to watch your son marry someone who thinks she's better than his family, who can afford to waste money on designer dresses while his mother faces homelessness." The raw pain in her voice was unmistakable, and for a moment the room seemed to hang in balance between sympathy and continued condemnation. Then Ryan stood up beside his wife, his face pale but his voice steady. "Mom, if you were having financial problems, why didn't you just ask for help? Why did you think the answer was to hurt Natasha?" It was the question that everyone in the room was thinking, and Dolores's inability to answer it with anything but bitter silence told them everything they needed to know about her motivations. The wedding reception, which should have been a celebration of love and new beginnings, had become something else entirely. A public reckoning with deception, resentment, and the consequences of choosing cruelty over honesty. And as Natasha sat at the head table, still wearing the thrift store dress that had started it all, she found herself wondering if the victory she had just achieved was worth the cost of the relationships it had destroyed. Into the charged atmosphere of the dining room, where conversations buzzed with the electric energy of social scandal and family drama, stepped an unexpected voice of reason. Judge Margaret Thornfield, Natasha's former mentor, and the woman who had presided over some of Millbrook Harbor's most contentious legal cases, rose slowly from her seat at one of the professional colleagues' tables. At 72, Judge Thornfield commanded respect through sheer presence rather than volume. Her silver hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon, and her navy blue dress spoke of understated authority earned through decades of navigating complex human conflicts.
When she stood, the surrounding conversations gradually quieted as guests recognized that someone significant was about to speak. "If I may," she said, her voice carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to restoring order to chaotic situations, "I believe we're witnessing something that goes much deeper than wedding day drama or family disagreements." Everyone turned to her, including Dolores, who looked like a trapped animal seeking any possible escape route from the judgment that surrounded her.
I've known Natasha Caldwell, for 5 years, Judge Thornfield continued, her gaze sweeping the room with the authority of someone who had spent decades weighing evidence and human motivations. I've watched her argue cases with passion and precision, always in service of justice and truth. What we've witnessed today is entirely consistent with those values. She paused, allowing her words to settle before continuing. However, I've also presided over enough family court cases to recognize desperation when I see it. And what I see in Mrs. Dolores Caldwell is not malice for its own sake, but the actions of someone who has been drowning and chose to pull others down rather than ask for help. The room held its collective breath as Judge Thornfield walked slowly toward the family table, where Dolores sat hunched in her chair, looking smaller and more vulnerable than she had all day. "Mrs. Caldwell," the judge said gently, "may I ask you a direct question?" Dolores looked up with red-rimmed eyes that held a mixture of fear and resignation. "I suppose you can ask me anything you want. Everyone else has." "When your husband passed away 5 years ago, did anyone at all, offer you practical help with managing the financial aftermath? Not sympathy or casseroles, but actual assistance with understanding your options, connecting with resources, or navigating the legal complexities of inheritance and debt?" The question caught everyone off guard with its specificity and compassion. Dolores stared at the judge for a long moment, her mouth opening and closing as if she couldn't quite process being asked about her experience rather than being lectured about her behavior. No, she finally whispered. "Everyone said how sorry they were, how Bob was such a good man, how I was so strong for handling everything myself, but no one actually asked if I knew what I was doing or if I needed help understanding the paperwork." Judge Thornfield nodded knowingly. "And when you discovered that your husband had borrowed against the house to cover medical expenses from his final illness, did you have anyone to explain your options? Did anyone help you understand bankruptcy law or connect you with housing assistance programs or even just sit with you while you made the difficult decisions about your future?" "No," Dolores said, her voice breaking slightly. "Bob had always handled the finances. I didn't even know how to read the mortgage statements. By the time I understood what was happening, the foreclosure process had already started, and everyone, the bank officers, the lawyers, even the real estate agents, they all talked to me like I was stupid for not understanding what was happening." A murmur of uncomfortable recognition rippled through the room as guests began to see the situation from a perspective they hadn't considered. Uncle Harold shifted in his seat, his earlier shock giving way to something that looked uncomfortably like guilt. "And in the 5 years since, as you struggled with rental payments on a fixed income, as you watched your son build a relationship with a successful professional woman, as you faced the possibility of homelessness, did it feel like anyone in your family or social circle would understand or support you if you admitted the truth about your situation? How could I tell them? How could I tell Ryan that his father left us in debt instead of leaving him inheritance? How could I admit to Harold and the rest of Bob's family that I'd lost the house they all remembered from family gatherings? How could I explain to everyone at church, everyone in this room, that the widow of respected Robert Caldwell was 3 months behind on rent for a 1-bedroom apartment? The raw honesty of her admission created a different kind of silence than the shocked stillness that had followed Natasha's revelations. This was the heavy quiet of people confronting uncomfortable truths about their own assumptions and the invisible struggles of those around them. Judge Thornfield turned to address the room more broadly. "I've seen this pattern countless times in my courtroom.
People facing financial crisis often choose to maintain appearances rather than seek help, because our society has somehow decided that needing assistance is shameful, while pretending everything is fine is admirable. She looked directly at Uncle Harold. Mr. Caldwell, when was the last time you had a serious conversation with your sister-in-law about her actual circumstances rather than her ability to manage everything so well? Harold's face flushed red. I assumed she seemed to be doing fine. She never said anything about having problems. And did you ask? Did anyone in this family create space for her to be honest about struggling, or did everyone just compliment her on her strength and independence? The judge's questions were creating a ripple effect of uncomfortable self-reflection throughout the dining room. Guests who had spent the cocktail hour accepting Dolores' stories about family wealth were now forced to confront their own role in maintaining the fiction. Ryan stood up slowly, his face pale with dawning realization. "Mom," he said quietly, "you could have told me. We could have figured something out together."
"Could I?" Dolores asked, looking at her son with an expression of desperate hope mixed with years of accumulated hurt. "Ryan, you were so proud when you introduced Natasha to everyone. You talked about her house, her career, her success. How was I supposed to tell you that your mother was facing eviction? How was I supposed to admit that everything you thought you knew about our family's stability was a lie?" Natasha, who had been listening to this exchange with growing understanding, felt something shift inside her chest. The righteous anger that had fueled her morning strategy was being complicated by a perspective she hadn't fully considered. "But that doesn't excuse what you did to Natasha this morning," Ryan said, his voice strengthening. "You deliberately tried to humiliate her." "You're absolutely right," Judge Thornfield interjected before Dolores could respond. "Nothing excuses deliberate cruelty, regardless of the circumstances that motivated it. But understanding those circumstances is essential if this family wants to move forward rather than simply assign blame." She turned to Natasha with the expression of someone who is about to ask a difficult question. "Natasha, as someone who specializes in real estate law, what options are typically available to someone in Mrs. Caldwell's situation? And as someone who owns property and has legal expertise, what could you have done to help if you had known the truth 3 months ago instead of discovering it through research this week?" The question hit Natasha like a physical blow. In all her strategic planning for this morning's confrontation, she had focused on exposing Dolores' lies and protecting herself from future manipulation. She had not considered what she might have done differently if she had approached the situation as a problem to be solved rather than a war to be won. "There are programs," she said slowly, her legal mind automatically cataloging possibilities even as her heart grappled with the implications. "Emergency rental assistance, mediation with landlords, bankruptcy protection options. If I had known earlier, we could have—" She trailed off, realizing that "if I had known earlier" raised the question of why she hadn't known, why no one had created space for that knowledge to be shared. Judge Thornfield nodded. "Family therapists have a term for this pattern: the fiction of independence. It's when family members choose to suffer in isolation rather than risk being seen as burdens, while other family members accept that fiction because it's easier than asking difficult questions or offering difficult help." She turned around the room at the faces of people who were beginning to understand that they were all part of a larger story than they had realized. What happened this morning with the wedding dress was inexcusable, but it was also the desperate act of someone who has been drowning for 5 years while everyone around her complimented her swimming technique. The judge's words hung in the air, transforming the reception from a simple story of betrayal and revenge into something far more complex, an examination of how families can fail each other through well-intentioned neglect, how pride can become a prison, and how the fear of being judged can lead people to make choices that destroy the very relationships they're trying to preserve. Natasha felt the foundations of her morning's certainty beginning to shift, not because Dolores' actions were any less wrong, but because the context Judge Thornfield had provided made the situation far more complicated than a simple case of good versus evil. For the first time since putting on the thrift store dress that morning, she found herself wondering if there might have been a different way to handle this situation, one that sought to solve problems rather than win battles.
From across the room, Mrs. Patterson from the yacht club stood up, her composure clearly shaken. "Dolores, I've been telling people for months what an inspiration you are, how gracefully you've adapted to widowhood, how well you've maintained your independence. I never realized I was putting pressure on you to keep up appearances, rather than asking if you needed support." What followed was unlike anything anyone in the room had ever witnessed at a social gathering. One by one, people began standing up to acknowledge their own roles in creating the isolation that had driven Dolores to such desperate measures. It wasn't organized or planned. It was an organic response to Judge Thornfield's challenge to examine their own assumptions and behaviors. Dr. Maureen Blake, Natasha's colleague from the law firm, stood with a professional's recognition of missed opportunities. "As attorneys, we should have recognized the signs," she said, looking directly at Natasha. "When someone starts making vague references to family property and inheritance, especially in the context of other financial conversations, that's often a red flag for someone who's struggling but doesn't know how to ask for help." The observation hit Natasha like a physical blow. She had indeed noticed Dolores's occasional comments about the family house and Ryan's future inheritance, but she had interpreted them as bragging rather than as potential cries for help disguised as boasting. Thomas, Natasha's father, who had remained quietly supportive throughout the evening's revelations, now stood with the measured bearing of someone who worked in financial services and understood the broader implications of what they were discussing. "There's something else we need to acknowledge," he said, addressing the room with the authority of someone who had spent decades helping people navigate financial crises. "This pattern, the fiction of independence, the assumption that silence means everything is fine, the complimenting of strength instead of offering practical help, this isn't unique to one family. This happens in our community all the time." He gestured toward the assembled guests. "How many people in this room are struggling with situations they feel they can't discuss because we've all agreed that needing help is somehow shameful? How many of us have smiled and said, 'I'm fine,' when we weren't fine because we thought that was what was expected of us?" The question created a ripple of uncomfortable recognition throughout the dining room. Heads turned as people made eye contact with neighbors and friends, seeing them perhaps for the first time not as players in a social performance, but as fellow humans navigating challenges that were often invisible to others. Patricia, Natasha's mother, stood up from the parents' table with tears in her eyes. "Dolores," she said, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who understood struggle intimately. "After my husband left when Natasha was 12, I spent years pretending I had everything under control. I was so afraid that if I admitted I was struggling, people would think I was weak, or that Natasha would lose confidence in me." I paused, clearly fighting emotion. "I wish someone had told me then what I want to tell you now, that asking for help isn't a sign of failure. It's a sign of wisdom. And I wish I had been brave enough to ask you directly if you needed support, rather than just assuming you were as strong as you appeared to be." The parallel between their situations wasn't lost on anyone in the room, least of all Natasha, who was beginning to understand that her mother's fierce independence during her own childhood might have come at a cost she had never recognized. Judge Thornfield, still standing near the family table, nodded approvingly at the direction the conversation was taking. "This is what restorative justice looks like," she said to the room. "Instead of simply punishing wrong behavior, we examine the conditions that created it and work together to address the underlying problems." She turned to Natasha with a look that was both challenging and supportive. "Natasha, you had every right to expose the lies and defend yourself from humiliation. Your response this evening was legally sound, strategically effective, and morally justified.
But now that we understand more about the context, what do you think should happen next? It was the kind of question Judge Thornfield had posed to Natasha countless times during her mentorship, not asking her to abandon her principles, but challenging her to consider whether her goals could be achieved through means that created healing rather than just victory. Natasha stood slowly, her mind racing through possibilities she hadn't considered when she had planned this morning's counterattack. Around her, 200 guests waited to see how someone trained in the law would respond when faced with a situation that demanded not just justice, but wisdom. "I think," she said carefully, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone working through a complex problem in real time, "that we need to separate what happened this morning from what happens going forward." She looked directly at Dolores, who was watching her with an expression that mixed hope with resignation. "What you did to my dress was wrong. The lies you told about our family's financial situation were wrong. The deliberate attempt to humiliate me on my wedding day was cruel and unacceptable."
Dolores nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I know. I'm so sorry, Natasha. I'm so sorry." "But," Natasha continued, and the single word seemed to change the entire energy in the room, "I'm a real estate attorney with connections to every housing assistance program in 3 counties. I have colleagues who specialize in bankruptcy law, debt mediation, and elder law. I have professional relationships with social workers, financial counselors, and nonprofit organizations." She paused, the implications of what she was about to say clearly weighing on her. 3 months ago, if you had come to me and said, "Natasha, I'm facing eviction, and I don't know what to do," we could have probably solved this problem in a week. The simple statement reframed everything. Instead of a family drama about betrayal and revenge, they were now looking at a practical problem that had been allowed to fester because no one had created space for honest conversation about real needs. Ryan, who had been sitting in stunned silence as the evening's revelations unfolded, suddenly stood up with the expression of someone who had just understood something crucial. "The eviction notice," he said, looking between his mother and his wife. "How much time do we actually have? What are the real deadlines we're working with?" Natasha pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts. "Amanda Foster," she said, pressing call. "The property management attorney I texted during the ceremony. If the notice was filed last Tuesday, we have until this coming Monday to respond, but there are several options for delays and negotiations if we act quickly." As she waited for Amanda to answer, she looked around the room at the faces of people who had come to celebrate a wedding and found themselves witnesses to something entirely different. A community discovering that they had the power to solve problems together if they were willing to ask the right questions and offer practical help instead of empty praise. "Amanda?" Natasha said when the call connected. "It's Natasha. I know it's Saturday evening, but I have a family emergency that requires immediate legal intervention. Can you conference in someone from Whitmore Property Management? We need to discuss emergency alternatives to an eviction proceeding." The transformation was remarkable. Within minutes, the wedding reception had become an impromptu crisis intervention, with guests offering connections, resources, and practical assistance. Uncle Harold was calculating rental assistance amounts on his phone, Patricia was researching emergency housing programs, and Dr. Blake was texting contacts in elder law. What had begun as Natasha's strategic revenge was evolving into something far more powerful, a demonstration of what becomes possible when a community stops maintaining comfortable fictions and starts addressing real problems together. The Harbor Club's dining room had been transformed into an unlikely command center, with guests huddled around tables making phone calls, exchanging contact information, and coordinating resources with the efficiency of a well-oiled crisis response team.
Amanda Foster's voice crackled through Natasha's phone speaker as she explained the legal options available for emergency eviction intervention, while Uncle Harold had already connected with a rental assistance program that could provide emergency funds within 48 hours. But amid all the practical problem-solving and community mobilization, there remained an unresolved tension at the heart of the evening's events. Dolores sat at the family table, no longer the composed matriarch who had held court during cocktail hour, but also not quite the desperate woman who had been exposed during dinner. She was something more complex, someone caught between gratitude for the unexpected help and the shame of having her deception revealed so publicly. Natasha finished her call with Amanda and looked around the room at the remarkable scene unfolding. In any other circumstances, she would have been amazed by the community's response, energized by the collective problem-solving, and proud of her role in transforming a crisis into an opportunity for positive change. But this wasn't any other circumstance. This was her wedding day, and the woman who had sabotaged it was sitting 10 feet away, surrounded by family members who were now rushing to help her with problems she could have shared months ago. Judge Thornfield approached Natasha with the careful step of someone who recognized that the most difficult conversation was still ahead. "You know this isn't finished yet," the judge said quietly. "All the practical help in the world won't address the fundamental relationship issues between you and your mother-in-law. That requires a different kind of conversation."
The suggestion was both appealing and terrifying. The public nature of the evening's revelations had been part of Natasha's strategy for exposing Dolores's lies, but it also meant that any resolution, or failure to reach resolution, would be equally public. Ryan appeared at her elbow, his face showing the exhaustion of someone who had been emotionally whipsawed for the past several hours. "Tash," he said quietly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." She turned to face him, noting that he looked older than he had that morning, as if the day's events had forced him to confront realities about his family that he had been avoiding for years. "When you planned this whole thing, the documents, the exposure, all of it, were you planning to leave room for forgiveness? Or was this always going to end with my mother being completely cut out of our lives?" It was a fair question, and one that Natasha realized she had been avoiding asking herself. In all her strategic planning, she had focused on justice, accountability, and consequences. She had not seriously considered what forgiveness might look like, or whether it was even possible after such a deliberate betrayal. "I don't know," she said honestly. "This morning, I was focused on making sure she could never do something like this again. I wanted consequences. I wanted her to understand that I wasn't going to be a victim." "And now?" Natasha looked across the room at Dolores, who was listening to Uncle Harold explain the rental assistance application process with the focused attention of someone clinging to a lifeline. "Now I'm wondering if consequences and problem-solving have to be mutually exclusive," she said slowly. "I'm wondering if it's possible to say what you did was unacceptable and can never happen again, while also saying, let's fix the underlying problems that made you think this was your only option." Ryan's shoulders seemed to relax slightly. "So you're not planning to cut her out completely?" "I'm planning to have a conversation about boundaries, about what needs to change if we're going to have any kind of relationship going forward, about what accountability looks like and what support looks like, and whether it's possible to have both." She straightened her shoulders and walked over to the family table, where the practical discussions about rental assistance and legal options were beginning to wind down. The conversations quieted as guests sensed that something significant was about to happen. "Dolores," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the now quiet section of the room, "I think we need to talk. Privately, if that's what you prefer, or here in front of everyone, if you're comfortable with that. But we need to talk." Dolores looked up with red-rimmed eyes that held a mixture of fear and resignation. "Here's fine," she said quietly. "I think I've had enough of keeping things private."
Natasha pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, very conscious that they were essentially conducting family therapy in front of 200 wedding guests. But given how the evening had unfolded, it somehow felt appropriate. "I need you to understand something," Natasha began, her voice calm but firm. "What you did this morning was cruel. It was calculated. It was designed to humiliate me on one of the most important days of my life. And the fact that you were struggling financially doesn't excuse that." Dolores nodded, tears beginning to flow again. I know it was wrong. I was so angry at everything, at losing Bob, at losing the house, at watching you have everything I used to have. And when I saw that dress, that beautiful, expensive dress, I wanted you to feel as small as I felt." The raw honesty of the admission created a silence that felt different from the shocked stillness that had followed earlier revelations. This was the quiet of people witnessing something real and difficult and necessary. "I can understand being angry. I can understand feeling overwhelmed and desperate. What I can't understand is why you thought the answer was to hurt me instead of asking for help. Because asking for help meant admitting that everything people believed about me was a lie. It meant admitting that I wasn't the strong, independent widow everyone kept praising. It meant that Bob hadn't left me secure, that I didn't know how to manage money, that I was failing at the one thing I was supposed to be good at, taking care of myself." I felt something shift in my chest. Not quite forgiveness, but something closer to understanding. "So, instead of risking people thinking less of you for needing help, you chose to make them think less of me for having nice things. It sounds horrible when you put it like that." It was horrible, but it was also human. Terrible, but human.
She leaned forward slightly, her tone becoming more serious. "Here's what needs to happen if we're going to move forward. First, you need to accept help with your housing situation without any shame or apology. The people in this room want to help, and you're going to let them." Dolores nodded quickly. "Yes, I will, I promise." "Second, you're going to be honest with Ryan and with me about your financial situation going forward. No more lies about inheritance or family property. No more pretending you're fine when you're not. If you need help, you ask for it directly instead of trying to manipulate situations to make yourself feel better." "I understand." "Third," Natasha said, her voice taking on the steel of someone setting non-negotiable boundaries, "you will never, ever try to undermine me or sabotage my happiness again. Not out of jealousy, not out of desperation, not for any reason. If you have a problem with me, you talk to me directly. If you have a problem with our marriage, you talk to Ryan directly, but you don't try to hurt me to make yourself feel better. Are we clear?" "We're clear," Dolores whispered. "And fourth," Natasha continued, "we're going to figure out how to build a real relationship instead of the performance we've been putting on for the past 8 months. I don't need you to like everything about me, and you don't need to pretend to. But we do need to treat each other with basic respect and honesty." Dolores looked up with something that might have been hope. "Do you think that's possible? After what I did?" Natasha was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. Around them, the wedding guests waited to hear her answer, understanding that it would set the tone not just for this family's future, but for how they all thought about forgiveness, accountability, and the possibility of healing after betrayal. "I think," she said finally, "that what you did this morning was unforgivable. But I also think that forgiveness isn't always about the action. Sometimes it's about the person who committed it and whether they're willing to do the work to change." She stood up and extended her hand to Dolores, not in friendship, but in the formal recognition of an agreement reached. "Are you willing to do that work?" Dolores stood and took her hand, her grip firm despite her tears. "Yes, I'm willing to do whatever it takes." "Then we have a place to start," Natasha said. "It's not friendship, and it's not forgetting what happened, but it's a place to start." As applause broke out around the dining room, not the polite applause of a wedding reception, but the genuine appreciation of people who had witnessed something real and difficult and ultimately hopeful,
Natasha realized that her wedding day had become something she had never expected. It had become the day she learned the difference between winning and healing. 6 months later, Natasha stood in the kitchen of her Victorian house on Elm Street, preparing coffee for the monthly meeting that had become an unexpected cornerstone of Millbrook Harbor's social fabric. Through the window overlooking the harbor, she could see the lighthouse beams sweeping across the water in its eternal rhythm, a reminder that some things endure while others transform completely. The Harbor Circle, as it had come to be known, had grown from that extraordinary wedding reception into something none of them had anticipated. What had started as an emergency intervention for Dolores's housing crisis had evolved into a regular gathering where community members could discuss real problems and coordinate practical solutions without the social performance that typically characterized small-town interactions. Judge Thornfield had been right about the power of that first public conversation. Once people had witnessed authentic vulnerability being met with genuine help rather than judgment, it had changed something fundamental about how they related to each other. The fiction of universal independence had been shattered, replaced by something far more valuable, a community that knew how to ask for help and how to offer it effectively. Dolores arrived first, as she had for every meeting since the Harbor Circle had begun. She looked different than she had on the wedding day, not just because she was dressed more casually in jeans and a sweater, but because she carried herself with the relaxed posture of someone who no longer had to maintain an exhausting performance of having everything under control. "Morning, Natasha," she said, hanging her coat on the hook by the back door with the easy familiarity of someone who had become a regular presence in the house. "I brought those financial literacy worksheets from the community college. 3 more people have signed up for the program this week." The relationship between them had settled into something neither of them had expected. Not the warm mother-daughter bond that Dolores had once claimed to want, nor the polite distance that Natasha had once thought necessary, but something more honest and perhaps more valuable. They worked well together on practical projects, respected each other's boundaries, and had learned to navigate disagreements without resorting to manipulation or warfare.
Ryan appeared from his home office where he'd been participating in a conference call about a new medical equipment contract. His relationship with his mother had undergone its own transformation, built on a foundation of honesty that was sometimes uncomfortable, but infinitely more sustainable than the careful fiction they had maintained before. "Mom's becoming famous," he said to Natasha with a grin. "The State Housing Authority wants her to speak at their annual conference about community-based support networks." It was true. Dolores had become an unexpectedly effective advocate for people facing housing insecurity, precisely because she spoke from experience rather than theory. Her presentation about the fiction of independence and its role in preventing people from seeking help had been requested by social service organizations throughout Maine. Dr. Blake arrived next, followed by Patricia, Uncle Harold, and several others who had become regular attendees. The group had settled into a comfortable mix of people who had been present at the wedding and community members who had joined later, drawn by word of mouth about a place where real problems could be discussed without shame. "Before we start with new business," Judge Thornfield said as they settled around Natasha's dining room table with their coffee, "I think we should acknowledge something. It's been 6 months since this group formed, and I've been tracking the outcomes of our interventions." She pulled out a folder with the methodical precision of someone who still thought like a judge, even in retirement. 17 families have received emergency assistance through our network. 8 people have found no employment through connections made here. 5 small businesses have been saved through community support and expertise sharing. And 3 marriages have been strengthened through mediation services. The statistics were impressive. But what struck Natasha more was how normal it had all become. The idea that people might gather regularly to solve problems together, that expertise and resources might be shared without formal programs or bureaucracy, that vulnerability might be met with practical support rather than pity, all of this had become an unremarkable part of their weekly routine. "There's something else," Patricia added, looking at her daughter with the pride of someone who had watched her child grow in unexpected ways. "The model is spreading.
Communities in Portland, Bar Harbor, and Camden have all started their own harbor circles based on what we've built here. Natasha felt a complex mixture of pride and amazement. Her wedding day revenge plot had somehow spawned a regional movement toward community-based problem solving. It wasn't the outcome she had planned when she decided to expose Dolores's lies, but it was perhaps a better one. Speaking of spreading the model, Dr. Blake said, I've been invited to present our approach at the New England Bar Association's annual conference. They want to discuss how legal professionals can facilitate community-based conflict resolution. The irony wasn't lost on Natasha. Her career had been built on adversarial legal strategies, on winning cases by defeating opponents. But the most significant success of her professional life had come from learning when to stop fighting and start building. As the meeting progressed through its usual agenda, new requests for help, updates on ongoing situations, coordination of resources, Natasha found herself thinking about the wedding dress that had started it all. It still hung in her closet, carefully preserved in acid-free tissue paper, though not for the reasons she had originally intended. The Vera Wang gown, eventually recovered from Dolores's apartment where it had been carefully stored, had become something more than a wedding dress. It was a reminder of the difference between what she thought she wanted, validation, victory, the satisfaction of being right, and what she had actually needed, authentic relationships, community support, and the confidence that came from knowing she could navigate conflict without destroying the people involved. Ryan reached over and squeezed her hand as Uncle Harold described a new job placement program he was coordinating with local businesses. Their marriage had been strengthened by the crisis that could have destroyed it, not because the problems had been easy to solve, but because they had learned to address them together rather than choosing sides. There's one more thing, Dolores said as the meeting began to wind down. I wanted everyone to know that I've been accepted into the paralegal program at the community college. I start in the fall. The announcement was met with genuine applause. Dolores's decision to pursue legal training wasn't just about career development, it was about transforming her experience with housing insecurity into expertise that could help others navigate similar challenges. Dr. Blake recommended me for a scholarship program, Dolores continued, looking directly at Natasha. She said my personal experience with legal documents and housing issues, combined with my work here, made me an ideal candidate for specializing in tenant rights advocacy. It was a full-circle moment that none of them could have imagined 6 months ago. The woman who had sabotaged her daughter-in-law's wedding dress out of desperation and resentment was becoming a legal professional specifically to help other people avoid the isolation and confusion that had led to her own crisis.
As the meeting broke up and people began to leave, Judge Thornfield lingered behind with Natasha and Ryan. "You know," she said, settling back into her chair with the contentment of someone who had witnessed something remarkable, "in all my years on the bench, I never saw anything quite like what happened at your wedding reception." "You mean the public humiliation and family meltdown?" Natasha asked with a wry smile. "I mean the moment when a community chose to examine its own failures instead of just assigning blame," the judge replied. "The moment when people decided that solving problems was more important than maintaining comfortable illusions." She stood to leave, then paused at the door. "There's something I never told you about that night. When you stood up with those eviction papers, you had a choice. You could have simply destroyed your mother-in-law and walked away victorious. Instead, you chose to create space for everyone in that room to be better than they had been before." After everyone had gone, Natasha and Ryan sat on their front porch, watching the sunset paint the harbor in shades of gold and crimson. The house around them hummed with the satisfaction of a home that had become more than just a private refuge. It had become a center for community healing. "Do you ever regret it?" Ryan asked. "Not the confrontation with Mom, but everything that came after, the meetings, the committee work, the speaking engagements. Sometimes I wonder if you signed up for more than you bargained for when you married me."
Natasha considered the question seriously. Her life had indeed become more complicated than she had planned. The harbor circle meetings, the consultation requests from other communities, and the pro bono legal work that had grown out of her connections here, all of it took time and energy that she could have devoted to her private practice or personal interests. "You know what I regret?" she said finally. "I regret that it took a crisis to teach me the difference between being right and being wise. I regret that I spent so much time learning how to win arguments that I almost missed learning how to solve problems." She reached for his hand, feeling the wedding ring that had been placed there during a ceremony that was nothing like what either of them had planned, but everything they had needed. "But do I regret what our life has become? Not for a second. We're building something here that's bigger than just our marriage or our careers. We're proving that people can choose healing over revenge, community over isolation, truth over comfortable lies." As the lighthouse beams swept across their front yard, illuminating the garden they had planted together that spring, Natasha reflected on the unexpected wisdom that had emerged from her wedding day catastrophe. She had learned that justice without compassion was merely revenge, that winning without healing was ultimately hollow, and that the most powerful response to betrayal was not destruction, but transformation. The thrift store dress still hung in her closet too, carefully preserved alongside the Vera Wang gown, not as a symbol of humiliation, but as a reminder that sometimes the most important lessons come wrapped in the most unlikely packages. And sometimes, the best revenge is refusing to become the kind of person who needs it.